Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. It is Tuesday. Happy Tuesday. So, an assistant who worked for Diddy from 2007 to 2009 during the early part of Diddy's relationship with Cassie testified that he did not personally see any physical violence between them. But he did reveal a lot of things. This man, David James, was actually pretty funny. He made several people in the courtroom laugh. It kind of reminded me of the time when I was a teenager and had to testify for my best friend who was awkwarded. I made the judge and the people in the courtroom laugh during cross-examination. I was so innocent. I said, "Hey, you're trying to confuse me." All innocent. And they were really trying to confuse me. These bastards. Yeah, these bastards. They failed. But honestly, the key is to be honest. Because once you're honest, they can't trick you. They can't. That's how they get you. When you're not honest, you have to remember. So when they ask you the same question 5 different ways, the answer gonna stay the same because it's the truth. So yeah, that's what happened when I was a teenager. But anyway, here is the full transcript of everything David James said in court today. Next witness is David James. Prosecutor says, "Why are you here?" David James says, "I've been subpoenaed." Prosecutor says, "Were you Combs' personal assistant?" David James says, "From 2007 to 2009. Prosecutor says, "Who is that in this photo?" David James says, "That is David James." Prosecutor says, "That is yourself?" David James says, "Yes." David James says, "I went to college in Michigan. Later, I faxed my resume to Bad Boy." Prosecutor says, "Where was the interview?" David James says, 1710 Broadway. Prosecutor says, "Who did you meet?" David James says, "Tommy, his sister Keisha, and others." Prosecutor says, "How did they test you?" David James says, "They gave me 40 appointments and asked me to make a schedule. You had to know, for example, what time a particular show on Hot 97 came on." Prosecutor says, "What did Mr. Combs ask you?" David James says, "To make a spreadsheet for Miami." And I said, "I would know his food and restaurant preferences." He asked me why I would make a good assistant. I said, "Can't stop, won't stop. I got the job." Prosecutor says, "Did he have others?" David James says, "Miss Robles, Mr. Barber, and others." Prosecutor says, "What would you do as an assistant?" David James says, "Bad Boy 9 to 5, then out to dinner, then to the studio till 3 a.m. We'd get a call time at the end of the night." Prosecutor says, "Did you travel with Mr. Combs as well?" David James says, "Yes." Prosecutor says, "Who were the security staff?" David James says, D-Rock, Roger Bonds, Uncle Paulie. Prosecutor says, "You work 20 hours a day?" David James says, "Yes, security did too." Prosecutor says, "What did security staff tell you?" David James says, "To stay in my lane." Prosecutor says, "Who said that?" David James says, "Roger Bond, Uncle Paulie." Prosecutor says, "Focusing on his personal chef. Who is this?" David James says, "Chef Jordan Atkinson." Prosecutor says, "Did Mr. Combs have girlfriends then?" David James says, "Kim Porter, Sarah, Tara, Yana, and Cassie." Prosecutor says, "What was your first conversation with Cassie?" David James says, "We were on Star Island. Carrie Morgan was there too. Cassie said, 'This lifestyle is crazy.' I asked her, 'Why don't you leave?' She said, 'Sean controls my life, my music. He pays for my apartment.'" Prosecutor says, "Next conversation." David James says it was about her music, but the album never came out. Prosecutor says, did you overheard a conversation? David James says yes. David James says, Mr. Combs said, Kim is my queen out in LA with my family. He said, I have Cassie right where I want her. She's young and moldable. Prosecutor says, Your Honor, how much longer do you want to go? This would be a good place to take a break. The judge says, we'll break for the day. Then Diddy's lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, says, MDC Brooklyn makes us in VCT calls at 6 p.m. We need more. Ending at 3 p.m. helps if you can extend it. The judge says, put a letter on the docket. This was yesterday. Now today, they continued where they left off. Before the jurors come in, Mark Agnifilo says, we oppose David James testifying about the incident with Suge Knight. He's going to mention D-Rock, say he was a friend of Biggie Smalls. That's decades ago, not relevant. The judge says, seems you are previewing your cross-examination. Witness, personal assistant David James takes the stand. The judge says, good morning, welcome back. Then the courtroom deputy says, we are missing 4 jurors. It may be the subways. The judge says, okay, we'll wait. Then the jurors have belatedly arrived. Then prosecutor Slavic says, what about physical violence between Mr. Combs and Cassie? Did you personally observe it? David James says, no, I did not. Prosecutor Slavic says, do you remember a blog post? David James says, yes, I was in LA when he came back from a club. Slavic says, what did Mr. Combs say? David James says that someone was lying on him, saying he hit Cassie at the club. He went through my browser history. No one had ever done that to me. Slavic says, did Mr. Combs give you instructions about Cassie? David James says, to bring her food at the London hotel. Some Roscoe's. Slavic says, what is Roscoe's? David James says, some delicious fried chicken in Los Angeles. Slavic says, what did you do for Mr. Combs in New York? David James says, I would bring him applesauce, Jell-O, Fiji water, his toiletry bag with ointments just for men. We bought 40 items so he couldn't call us later. I would get a key like at the Trump International. David James says, I would set up the medicine bag and the personal LV bag. Slavic says, what was in it? David James says, Viagra, ecstasy, Percocets. Slavic says, how did you go about replenishing these supplies? David James says, I would use my personal credit card. Bad boy paid me back. Slavic says, who paid you back? David James says, usually Roger Bonds. Slavic says, did Mr. Combs ever stay alone in a hotel? David James says, never. Usually Cassie, sometimes other women. Slavic says, did he ask you for things during a stay? David James says, he would text me for an iPod or food. Slavic says, did anything strange ever happen? David James says, yes, in Miami. He asked for an iPod from his house on Star Island. I drove it to his hotel and knocked. No answer. I had the key. I would set up the room. Slavic says, what did you see? David James says, Cassie on the bed. There was another person who sort of scurried away and the shower was on. I thought Mr. Combs was in there. Slavic says, how was she sleeping? David James says, on her back. Diddy's lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, says, objection. The judge says, sustained. Slavic says, what about the other person? David James says he was about 5'8" with long hair. with a large endowment, yeah, down there. So the guy was well endowed, okay? He scurried away. Prosecutor Slavic says, "Did you ask anything?" David James says, "I wasn't hired to ask about their personal affairs." Slavic says, "Did you ever pick up drugs from Mr. Combs?" David James says, "Yes, Percocet at a pharmacy, sometimes in my name." Slavic says, "Did you give him permission to use your name?" David James says, "I don't recall that." Slavic says, Was there a drug dealer?" David James says, "Yes. His name is One Stop." Slavic says, "He met with a lot of people." David James says, "Yes, even former presidents." Slavic says, "Which one?" David James says, "Former President Obama." Slavic says, "What was your understanding would have happened if you had not done these things?" Mark Agnifilo says, "Objection." The judge says, "Sustained." Slavic says, "Did you ever take ecstasy?" David James says, "Yes, I was drinking Ciroc. I took ecstasy. I was diddy bopping." Slavic says, "What do you mean?" David James says, "I was vibing." Slavic says, "Did you speak with Mr. Combs about it?" David James says he was reviewing footage of the party. "We had a videographer who filmed the parties. He asked me, 'Hey, Playboy, was that you dancing around at the party?' I said, 'Yes.' And he said, 'I'm going to keep the video in case I ever need it.'" Slavic says, "What does that mean?" David James says that I would be embarrassed. Slavic says, "Did anything ever go missing?" David James says, "They said a bracelet was missing. Uncle Polly came to my hotel room and searched my belongings and those of my girlfriend at the time." Slavic says, could you have said no?" Agnifilo says, "Objection." The judge says, "Move on." Slavic says, "Did you ever had to take a lie detector test?" David James says, "Yes." Slavic says, "Who was present?" David James says, "Just me and this gentleman." It was very intimidating. They put monitors on my head, my chest, and my hand. Slavic says, "Could you refuse?" David James says, "Not to keep my job." Slavic says, "Did this happen again?" David James says, "Yes, when Mr. Combs said a watch of his had been stolen." Slavic says, "What was the result?" David James says, "The gentleman told me I seemed nervous. I said, 'Sure I am.'" David James says, "Once Capricorn Clark, Lauren London's sister, had to take a lie detector test to prove she wasn't part of a heist of Mr. Combs' jewelry." Slavic says, "Was there an incident at Mills Diner with Suge Knight?" David James says, "Yes. I drove the Silver Navigator to get cheeseburgers there." David James says, "D-Rock said, 'That's mother effing Suge Knight.' He went over and said, 'What's up?' Suge didn't recognize him. D-Rock said, 'I'm Biggie's boy.'" Biggie Smalls, okay? Slavic says, "What happened next?" David James says, "We noticed 4 black SUVs to different sides of the parking lot. I saw someone hand Suge Knight a gun. D-Rock said, 'We gotta get out of here.' We drove back to the house." Slavic says, "What did you find there?" David James says, "Cassie was crying. Mr. Combs got in the vehicle. I saw 3 guns on his lap." David James says, "I felt calm because we had been in a silver vehicle, now a black one. They wouldn't see us coming." Slavic says, "What did you find at Mel Diners?" David James says, "Suge Knight had left. Mr. Combs said, 'Drive around the block.'" Slavic says, "What did you decide?" David James says, "To leave the company. They offered me other positions, but I just wanted to leave. My life was at risk." Slavic says, "No further questions." The judge says, Mr. Agnifilo. Now, Diddy's lawyer, Agnifilo, says, you didn't tell all this the first time. David James says, they told me to stop, to not say anything that would incriminate me. Agnifilo says, look at the notes from your interview. Read it to yourself, then look up at me. David James says, okay. Agnifilo says, how did you recognize Suge Knight? David James says, I listen to hip-hop. Agnifilo says, were you drinking or smoking? David James says, no, sir. Agnifilo says, your mind was clear? David James says, as clear as it could be, working 20 hours a week at 4 in the morning. Agnifilo says, D-Rock opens the door. Suge Knight is a few cars over. David James says, window open. David James says, D-Rock says, I'm Biggie's boy. And then Suge recognizes him, gives him a dab. Diddy's lawyer, Agnifilo, says, what's a dab? David James says, handshake. Agnifilo says, did you leave D-Rock at the diner? Why are you smiling? David James says, cuz, that's a crazy question. Why would I? Agnifilo says, didn't you leave D-Rock at the diner? David James says, that makes no sense. Agnifilo says, I'm not asking what makes sense. I'm asking, did you? David James says, no. Agnifilo says, you said you saw Cassie and Mr. Combs? David James says, yes, Mr. Combs told me to drive. Agnifilo says, you don't know where Mr. Combs got the guns, do you? David James says, I didn't know we had guns until then. Agnifilo says, have you ever been in a situation like that? David James says, no. Agnifilo says, you didn't say, I don't want to drive to Suge Knight with guns. David James says, no. Agnifilo says, what exactly did you do before you got this job? David James says, I was a door-to-door salesman, then personal assistant. Agnifilo says, now, you were going with guns to confront someone? David James says, it was not ideal. Agnifilo says, you knew how to get to Mel's Diner, right? David James says, I frequent there all the time. Agnifilo says, you have never seen guns before, right? David James says, no. Agnifilo says, this is a radical departure from your job description. Is that an understatement? David James says, it is the understatement of the day so far. Agnifilo says, do you have immunity? David James says, ask my lawyer. I have some kind of offer agreement. Agnifilo says, prefer. You didn't tell anyone about this. David James says, only my wife. Agnifilo says, did you meet with the government this morning? David James says, yes, briefly, about what might come up in cross-examination. Agnifilo says, did the Mel's Diner incident come up? David James says, not that I recall. Agnifilo says, it was this morning. What did you talk about? David James says, your style. Agnifilo says, I'm dying to ask what they said, but I won't. Agnifilo says, I have a few more mundane questions. David James says, I love mundane questions. Agnifilo says, where did you travel with Mr. Combs? David James says, Ibiza, London, Saint-Tropez. Agnifilo says, where these vacations? David James says, business-oriented. Agnifilo says, what were you hired as? David James says, personal liaison, but I was a personal assistant. Agnifilo says, he met a high-level roster of people. David James says, second understatement of the day. Agnifilo says, why? David James says, he met with a who's who. Agnifilo says, it was important that he be prepared for this meeting, right? David James says, yes. Agnifilo says it was important that he be on time. David James says no. We would change meetings to fit his schedule all the time when he didn't want to show up at a certain time. Agnifilo says he had security because people wanted to touch him, right? David James says yes. In the airport and McDonald's. Agnifilo says, was he gracious? And David James says, I don't think gracious is a word I would use for Sean Combs. Agnifilo says, did he sign autographs? David James says no. Agnifilo says, you said he had stayed in the studio until 3 or 4 a.m. and you would stay with him. David James says yes, it was common. Agnifilo says, what sort of things would he want to always have with him? David James says ketchup, for example. Agnifilo says, did you know he put applesauce on cheeseburgers? David James says, no, but I knew he likes applesauce. Agnifilo says he liked Astroglide, condoms, and baby oil, but you didn't expense it through the business. David James says, usually not. I was told he didn't want to run them through the company. He didn't want a record of them. Agnifilo says, when you bought the 8-ball of Coke on Central Bass, you didn't tell Mr. Combs, did you? David James says he was asleep. Agnifilo says, tell me about your relationship with Roger Bonds. David James says, we talked about Bad Boy as a family. Agnifilo says, what do you mean? David James says, Mama Combs called me her son many times. Agnifilo says, what was the mission? David James says, make sure he's happy. Agnifilo says, was it fun? David James says, I enjoyed it from time to time. Agnifilo says, what was your relationship with Chef Jordan? David James says, professional. Agnifilo says, did you choke her? David James says, no. Prosecutor says, objection. The judge says, sidebar. Agnifilo says, tell me what happened. David James says, we were on Star Island. She told me where to take him. I grabbed her 2 wrists and said, stay in your effing lane. Agnifilo says, was there a fallout? David James says, it was reported to corporate headquarters. Mr. Combs called me in. David James says, Mr. Combs told me, you can't be putting your hands on women. He told me to give her a gift. Agnifilo says, what did you give her? David James says, I rolled up a blunt and gave it to her. Agnifilo says, did she like it? David James says, it appeared she did. Agnifilo says, you were in a car with Mr. Combs and who? David James says, Chris Lighty. Agnifilo says, you have taken ecstasy? David James says, I would party, sure. Agnifilo says, what were things like in the studio? Drugs? David James says, yes, it's a creative environment. David James says, I didn't smoke when working with Mr. Combs. Agnifilo says, but he caught you smoking once. David James says, I thought he was in for the night. I laid up. He came out. He said, what are you doing? I said, nothing. David James says, he said, if you are man enough to smoke, you are man enough to tell me. I said, okay, I'm smoking. He said, if I did it again, he would fire me. Agnifilo says, how about when you picked up 2 prostitutes and had sex with one? Prosecutor says, objection, 403. The judge says, overruled. David James says, she asked for $200. I called Roger Bonds and asked, what the hell? She asked to take a shower. I said, that's $200. And they laugh in the courtroom. Agnifilo says, on that note, no further questions. The judge says, redirect. Prosecutor Slavic says, what about the incident in Alpine, New Jersey? David James says to file a police report and say that Chef Jordan had been the aggressor. But I didn't file it. I drove around and told him I had made the report. Slavic says, what have we asked you to do? David James says, tell the truth. Slavic says, nothing further. The judge says, recross examination. Agnifilo says, you lied to Mr. Combs about filing the police report. David James says, yes. Agnifilo says, nothing further. Could we have a break? And then they took a break, and that was it for David James's testimony. All right, you guys, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any new updates. All right? Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.